Therigata. This unique Buddhist text is a part of a Sutta Pitaka is a collection of verses composed by bhikkhunis. It provides an insight into women's social as well as spiritual experiences. Punna, she was a dasi or a slave woman, went to the river each morning to fetch water for her master's household. There she would daily see a Brahmin performing bathing rituals. One morning she spoke to him. The following are the verses composed by Punna recording her conversation with the Brahmin. I am a water carrier. Even in the cold, I have always gone down to the water frightened of punishment or the angry word of high class woman. So what are you afraid of, Brahman, that makes you go down to the water? Thought your limbs shake with the bitter cold. The Brahman replied, I am doing good to prevent evil. Anyone young or old who has done something bad is freed by washing in water. Puna said, whoever told you you are freed from evil by washing in the water, in that case, all the frogs and turtles would go to heaven, and so would the water snakes and crocodiles. Don't do that thing. The fear of which leads you to the water. Stop now, Brahman. Save your skin from the cold. A woman water carrier, मथुरा, a 3rd century CE. ठीक है, तो थेरिकाटा के बारे में हमने पढ़ा. नेक्स्ट हम लोग ये पढ़ते हैं रूल्स फॉर मॉन्क्स एंड नन. देयर आर सम ऑफ द रूल्स लेड डाउन इन द विनय पिटाका. व्हेन felt when a new felt blanket rug has been made by a bhikkhu, it is to be kept for at least 6 years. If after less than 6 years he would have another new felt or the blanket rug made, regardless of whether or not he had disposed of the first, thus then unless he has been authorized by the bhikkhus, it is to be forfeited and confessed. In case of bhikkhu arriving at a family residence is presented with cakes or cooked grain meal, he may accept 2 or 3 bowlful if he so desire. If he should accept more than that, it is to be confessed. Having accepted the 2 or 3 bowlful and having taken them from there, he is to share them among the bhikkhus. This is the proper course here. Should any bhikkhu having set out bedding in a lodging belonging to the sangha, or having had it set out and then on departing neither put it away nor have it put it away, or should he go without taking leave, it is to be confessed. So basically, Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime of the Buddha and after his death, as it appealed to the many people dissatisfied with the existing religious practice and confused by the rapid social changes. Actually, the people at that time, they were dissatisfied with the kind of religious practice that were being uh, carried on at that time, and they were also confused by the rapid social changes. Okay, so they were very confused. So they were very so Buddhism gave them satisfaction. The importance attached to the conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth, emphasis placed on metta, fellow feeling, appealing, karuna, compassion, especially for those who were younger and weaker than oneself, but idea that drew men and women to Buddhist teaching. ठीक है, metta, fellow feeling, karuna, compassion. उसके बाद आता है stupa. We have seen that the Buddhist ideas and the practice emerged out of a process of dialogue with other traditions, including those of the Brahmin, Jains, and several others, not all of whose ideas and practice were preserved in text. Some of these interactions can be seen in the ways in which sacred places came to be identified. From the earliest time, people tended to regard certain places as sacred. These included sites with special trees or unique rock, or sites of awe-inspiring natural beauty. These sites with small shrines attached to them were sometimes described as chaitya. Buddhist literature mentions several chaitya. It also describes places. Now, what are chaitya? Chaitya may also have been derived from the word chitta, meaning a funeral pyre, and an extension of a funeral mound. ठीक है, तो ये एक मैप देख लेते हैं. बुद्धिस्ट साइट की बहुत सारी हैं, तो आप रिवर दिख रही है, इंडस, गंगा यमुना, फिर नर्मदा दिख रही है, महानदी, गोदावरी, नीचे देखो कृष्णा भी दिख रही है. तो अब हम सारी साइट एक बार देख लेते हैं. आपको दिख रही है लुम्बिनी, कुशीनगर, बाराबार, बोध गया, बारहुत, सारनाथ, श्रावस्ती. तो ये नाम एक बार देखना, बारहुत और बाराबार के हो गया, बोध गया, श्रावस्ती, सारनाथ ऊपर नीचे, लुम्बिनी, कुशीनगर, श्रावस्ती, सारनाथ, फिर इधर सांची है नर्मदा और तापी के बीच में. फिर आता है आपका महाराष्ट्र में, देखो अजंता है, नासिक, जुन्नार, कल्ले, अजंता, नासिक, नासिक, जुन्नार, कल्ले, नागार्जुन कोंडा, ठीक है, अमरावती. तो ये सब चीज़ें. बुद्धा's life where he was born, Lumbini, where he attained enlightenment, Bodh Gaya, where he gave his first sermon, Sarnath, and where he attained Nirvana, Kushinagar. तो born Lumbini, enlightenment, Bodh Gaya, first sermon, Sarnath, Nirvana, Kushinagar. Gradually, each of these places came to be regarded as sacred. We know that about 200 years after the time of the Buddha, Ashoka erected a pillar at Lumbini to mark the fact that he had visited the pillar. उन्होंने एक पिलर बनाया था Lumine में. Why were stupas built? There were other places too that were regarded as sacred. These was because the relics of Buddha, जैसे उनकी body के remains or objects used by him were buried there. These were mounds known as stupas. These are mounds known as stupas. The tradition of practice stupas may have been pre-Buddhist, but they came to be associated. क्या बुद्धिस्ट के टाइम पे ही थे? नहीं, pre-Buddhist टाइम से ही चले आ रहे थे stupa बनाना. But they have been they came to be associated with Buddhism since they contain relics regarded as sacred. The entire stupa came to be venerated as an emblem of both the Buddha as well as the Buddhism. According to a Buddhist text known as Asokavadana, Ashoka distributed portion of the Buddha's relics to every important towns and ordered the construction of stupas over them. By the 2nd century BCE, a number of stupas including those at Bharu, Sachi and Sanath had been built. बहुत सारे बन गए. तो दिख रहा था आपको, मैंने यहाँ पे दिखाया है. यहाँ पे भारूत है, ठीक है, साची है, जनता है, ये सब देख लो एक बार, ठीक है. सो नासिक, अजंता, जुन्नार, काले, सांची, अमरावती, बाराबार, बौद्ध गया और सारनाथ, श्रावस्ती, भारूत दिख रहा है. सारनाथ है, श्रावस्ती है, भारूत है, लुम्बिनी, कुशीनगर, तो ये सब है. तो हाउ वाज stupas built? Inscription found on the railing and the pillar of the stupas record donation made for the. जो भी इंस्क्रिप्शन लिखा है जैसे रेलिंग और पिलर्स में, वो दिखा है कि बहुत सारे डोनेशंस मिले हैं फॉर बिल्डिंग एंड डेकोरेटिंग देम. सम डोनेशंस वर मेड बाय किंग such as Chatwanas, others were made by guilds such as those of the ivory workers who financed part of one of the gate paths at Sanchi. So hundreds of donations were made by women and women who mentioned their names, sometimes adding the name of the place from where they came, as well as their occupation and names of their relative. Bhikkhu and Bhikkhuni also contributed towards building this monument. The structure of stupa. The stupa is a Sanskrit word meaning a heap. It originated as a simple semicircular mound of earth, later called anda. Gradually, it evolved into a more complex structure, balancing round and a square shape. Above the anda was the harmika. That was a balcony-like structure. ठीक है, अंडा के ऊपर हर्मिका बनाया गया था, बालकनी टाइप का. दैट रिप्रेजेंटेड द अबॉर्ड ऑफ गॉड. तो उसके बाद फिर यहाँ पे एक और चीज़ देखते हैं. Why was stupa? There is an except from the Mahaparinirvana Sutta part of the Sutta Pitaka. तो Mahaparinirvana Sutta किसका part है? Sutta Pitaka का. As the Buddha lay dying, Ananda asked him, what are we to do, Lord, with the remains of the Tathagat, another name for Buddha? The Buddha replied, hinder not yourself, Ananda, by honoring the remains of the Tathagat. Be jealous, be intent on your own good. But when pressed further, the Buddha said, at the four crossroads they should erect a thupa, Pali for stupa, to the Tathagat, and whosoever shall there place garlands or perfume or make a salutation here or become in its presence calm of the heart, that shall long be to them for the profit and joy. So इतना खास यहाँ पे कुछ मेंशन नहीं है. द स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ स्टूपा हमने बता दिया. अंडा के बाद हर का बालकनी लाइक था. एक वोटिव इंस्क्रिप्शन जो है सांची से मिले. हंड्रेड्स ऑफ सिमिलर इंस्क्रिप्शन हैव आल्सो बीन फाउंड एट भारूत एंड अमरावती, बताया ही था. फिर अराइजिंग फ्रॉम द हमिका एक मास निकलता है जिसे कहते हैं यष्टि. ठीक है, हर्मिका से क्या निकलता है? यष्टि. अराइजिंग फ्रॉम द हर्मिका वॉज अ मास कॉल्ड यष्टि, ऑफन सरमाउंटेड बाय द छतरी और अम्ब्रेला. Around the mount was a railing separating the sacred space from the secular world. The earliest stupas at Sanchi and Bharut were plain except for the stone railing, were resembled a bamboo or a wooden fence, and the gateways, which were richly carved and installed at the four cardinal points. Worshippers entered through the eastern gateway and walked around the mount in a clockwise direction, keeping the mount on the right, imitating the sun's course through the sky. Later, the mount of the stupas came to be elaborately carved with niche sculptures at Amravati and साजी के धेरी इन पेशावर पाकिस्तान. तो अमरावती में जो स्टूपा है और साजी के धेरी जो पेशावर में है, वो बहुत ही इलेबोरेटली डेकोरेट किया गया है. ठीक है, तो इन एलिवेशन ऑफ द ग्रेट स्टूपा ये देख लो. उसके बाद आता है डिस्कवरिंग स्टूपा, द फेट ऑफ अमरावती एंड सांची. ईच स्टूपा has a history of its own. As we have just seen, some of these are histories of how they were built, but they are histories of discoveries as well. And let us now turn to some of these. In 1796, a local Raja who wanted to build a temple stumbled upon the ruins of a stupa at Amravati. So he decided to use the stone and thought there might be some treasures buried in what seemed to be a hill. Some years later, a British officer named Colin Mackenzie visited the site. Although he found several pieces of sculptures and made detailed drawings of them, these reports were never published. फिर 1854 में एक वॉल्टर एलियट आए थे. He was the commissioner of Guntur, Andhra Pradesh, visited Amravati and collected several sculptures, pennants and took them away to Madras. They came to be called the Elliot marbles after him. He also discovered the remains of the Western Gateway and came to the conclusion that the structure at Amravati was one of the largest and the most magnificent Buddhist stupa ever built. By the 1850s, some of the slabs from Amravati had begun to be taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal, जो कि कलकत्ता में था, Indian office in Madras, and even to London. So it was not unusual to find these sculptures adorning the gardens of British administration. In fact, any new officials in the area continued to remove the sculptures from the site on the ground that earlier officials had done. One of the few men who had different point of view was an archaeologist जिसका नाम था H.H. Cole. He wrote, "It seemed to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art." He believed that museums should have plaster cast specimens of sculpture. Sculpture का plaster एक clay like structure आप ले सकते हो, whereas the originals should remain where they have been found. Unfortunately, Cole did not succeed in convincing the authorities about the Amravati, although his plea for in situ preservation was adopted in the case of Sanchi. Why did Sanchi survive while Amravati did not? Perhaps Amravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the find and realized how critical it was to preserve things where they had been found instead of removing them from the site. So, when Sanchi was discovered in 1818, three of its four gateways were still standing. The fourth was lying on the spot where it had fallen, and the mount was in a good condition. Even so, it was suggested that the gateway be taken to either Paris or London. Finally, a number of factors helped to keep Sanchi as it was, so it stand. Whereas the Mahachati at Amravati is not just an insignificant little mound totally denuded of its former glory. Former glory. This is a section of gateway. Do you think the sculptures at Sanchi he wanted to depict the scroll being unfurled? In situ means on the spot. Sculpture. We have just seen how sculptures were removed from stupas and transported all the way to Europe. This happened partly because those who saw them considered them to be very beautiful and valuable and wanted to keep them for themselves. So let us look some of these more closely. Stories in stone. You may have seen wandering storytellers carrying scrolls. ठीक है चरण चित्रास of cloth or paper with pictures on them and painting to the pictures as they tell the story. So आप इस फिगर को देखो that is 4.13 this one. ठीक है ठीक है. At first sight, the sculpture seems to depict a rural scene with thatched hut and trees. However, art historians who have carefully studied the sculptures at Sanchi identify a scene from the Vishantara Jataka. This is a story about a generous prince who gave away everything to a Brahmin and went to live in the forest with his wife and his children. Vishantara Jataka. As you can see in this case, historians often try to understand the meaning of sculptures by comparing it with textual evidence. Art historians had to acquire familiarity with the hagiographies of the Buddha in order to understand Buddha's sculpture. Although, according to hagiographies, the Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree, many early sculptors did not show the Buddha in human form. Instead, they showed his presence through symbol. The empty seat was meant to indicate the meditation of Buddha, and the stupa was meant to represent the Mahaparinirvana. Stupa क्या है? Mahaparinirvana. Another frequently used symbol was the wheel. This stood for the first sermon of the Buddha. The wheel signifies Buddha का पहला sermon जो कि सारनाथ में हुआ था एज इट्स ऑब्वियस और महापरिनिर्वाण व स्टुपा ठीक है empty seat meditation as it is obvious as sculptures cannot be understood literally. For instance, the tree does not stand simply for a tree but symbolizes an event in the life of the Buddha. In order to understand such symbol, historians have to familiarize themselves with the traditions of those who produced these works of art. Popular tradition. Other sculptures at Sanchi were perhaps not directly inspired by the Buddhist ideas. These include beautiful women singing, swinging from the edge of the gateway, holding onto a tree. Initially, scholars were a bit intrigued about this image, which seemed to have a little to do with the renunciation. However, after examining other literary traditions, they realized that it could be a representation of what is described in Sanskrit as Salla Bhanjika. According to a popular belief, this was a woman whose touch caused trees to flower and bear fruit. It is likely that this was regarded as an auspicious symbol and integrated into the decoration of the stupa. The Salla Bhanjika motif suggests that many people who turn to Buddhism enrich it with their own pre-Buddhist or even non-Buddhist belief, practice, and ideas. Some of the recurrent motifs in the sculpture at Sanchi were evidently derived from these traditions. There are other things, images as well. For instance, some of the finest depictions of animals are found here. These animals include elephant, horses, monkey, cattle. While the Jatakas contain several animal stories that are depicted at Sanchi, it is likely that many of these animals यहाँ पे एक थोड़ा सा ध्यान से एक इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज़ है जो सल्ला जी का शालाबंजी का मोटिव that many people who turn to Buddhism enriched it with their own pre-Buddhist and even non-Buddhist belief practice. तो जितने ज़्यादा डेसिबल्स उसमें आते जाते थे तो वो अपनी जितनी भी बिलीव प्रैक्टिस और आइडियाज़ लेके आते थे तो वो क्या कर रहे हैं उसे और एनरिच कर रहे हैं. Some of the recurrent motive in the sculptures at Sanchi were evidently derived from this tradition. There are other images as well. ठीक है. फॉर इंस्टेंस सम ऑफ द फाइनेस्ट डिपिक्शन ऑफ एनिमल्स आर फाउंड हियर. यहाँ पे एनिमल कौन कौन से एलिफेंट को बनाया गया, हॉर्सेस, मंकी, कैटल. Jatakas contain several animal stories that are repeated as such. It is likely that many of these animals they were carved to create lively scenes to draw viewers. Also, animals are often used as a symbol of human attribute. Elephant, for example, depicted to signify strength, wisdom. Okay. Now this one. Painting from the past. While stone sculptures survive the ravages of time and is therefore most easily available to the historian, other visual means of communication as a painting were also used in the past. Those who had survived best are on the walls of the cave, of which those from Ajanta Maharashtra are most famous. Painting Ajanta depict the stories from the Jataka. These include depiction of courtly life, procession, men, women at work, festival. The artists used the techniques of shading to give the 3D quality. Some of the paintings are extremely naturalistic. Painting from Ajanta. This is Gaj Lakshmi, a serpent at Sanchi. So another motif is that of a woman surrounded by lotuses and elephant. ठीक है. क्या नाम है इनका? गाज लक्ष्मी. Lotus and element, which seem to be the sprinkling water on her, which seem to be sprinkling water on her as if performing an abhishek or consecration. While some students identify the figure as Maya, the mother of Buddha, others identify with the popular goddess Gaja Lakshmi, the goddess of good fortune, who is associated with elephant. It is also possible that devotees who saw these sculptures identified the figures with both Maya and Gaja Lakshmi. Consider too the serpent which is found on the several pillars. ठीक है. This motif seems to be derived from the popular tradition, which were not always recorded in text. Interestingly, one of the earliest modern art historians, James Ferguson, considers Sanchi to be a center of tree and serpent worship. सांची में क्या होता था? It is a center of tree and serpent worship. James Ferguson ने कहा था, he was not familiar with Buddhist literature, most of which had not yet been translated, and arrived at this conclusion by studying only the image on their own. So, naya religious tradition, the development of Mahayana Buddhism. By the 1st century CEE, there is evidence of change in Buddhist ideas and practice. Early Buddhist teachings had given great importance to self-effort in achieving nirvana. अगर आपको निर्वाणा लेना है तो self effort है. Besides, the Buddha was regarded as a human being who attained enlightenment and nirvana through his own effort. However, gradually the idea of savior emerged. It was believed that he was the one who could ensure salvation. मतलब savior आएगा वो आपको salvation दिलाने में help करेगा. Simultaneously, the concept of the bodhisattva also developed. Bodhisattvas they were perceived as deeply compassionate beings who accumulated merit through their effort, but used this not to attain nirvana, and thereby they abandoned the world, but to help others. And the worship of images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became an important part of this tradition. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana, literally the Great Vehicle. Those who adopted these beliefs described the old tradition as Hinayana or the Lesser Vehicle. Hinayana or Theravada, followers of Mahayana regarded other Buddhists as followers of supporters of Mahayana regarded other Buddhists as followers of Hinayana. However, followers of the older tradition described themselves as Theravadins, that is, those who followed the path of old respected teachers and the Theras. ठीक है, Theravada. Image of Buddha from Mathura. The growth of Puranic tradition. Unitism. The notion of a savior was not unique to Buddhism. We find similar ideas being developed in different ways within the tradition that we now consider part of Hinduism. तो Hinduism में savior आपके ब्राह्मण के फॉर्म में. These include Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as a principal deity. ठीक है. Saivism, a tradition within which Shiva is regarded as chief god, in which there was a growing emphasis on the worship of the chosen deity. ठीक है. In such worship, the bond between the devotee and the god was visualized as one of love and devotion or bhakti. In the case of Vaishnavism, cults develop around the various avatar or incarnation of the Vishnu. 10 avatars were recognized within the tradition. These were forms these were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whenever it was threatened by disorder and destruction because of the dominance of evil forces. It is likely that the different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Recognizing each of these local deities as a form of Vishnu was one way of creating a more unified religious tradition. Some of these forms were represented in sculptures, as were other deities. Shiva, for instance, was symbolized by the linga, although he was occasionally represented in human form too. All such representation depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities and their attributes through symbols such as headdresses, ornaments, ayudhas, the weapons or the auspicious object the deities hold in their hand, how they are seated, etc. To understand the meaning of these sculptures, historians have to be familiar with the stories behind them, many of which are contained in the Purana compiled by Brahmins by about the middle of the first millennium CE. They contain much that had been composed and been in circulation for centuries, including stories about the gods and goddesses. Generally, they were written in simpler Sanskrit verses, and they were meant to be read aloud to everybody, including women Shudras who did not have access to Vedic learning. Much of what is considered in the Puranas evolved through interaction among the people, that is, the priest, merchant, ordinary men, women who traveled from place to place, they shared ideas and their belief. We know, for instance, the Vasudeva Krishna, he was an important deity in the Mathura region. Over centuries, his verses spread to other parts of the country as well. Image of Durga, Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu building temple. Around the time that the stupas at sites such as Sanchi were acquiring their present form, the first temple to house image of god and goddess were also being built. The early temple was a small square room, जिसे कहते थे गर्भगृह, with a single doorway for the worshipper to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure known as Sikhar was built over the central shrine. Temple walls were often decorated with sculptures. Later temples became far more elaborate with assembly halls, huge walls, gateway, arrangement for supplying water. ठीक है. Some of the unique features of early temples was that some of these were hollowed out of a huge rock as artificial cave. The tradition of building artificial caves was an old one. Some of the earliest, अब ये सीखना, शिखर गर्भ, ये दिस इज अ टेम्पल इन दियोगढ़. दियोगढ़ कहाँ पे? उत्तर प्रदेश में. ये देखो, दिस इज विष्णु रिक्लाइनिंग ऑन द सर्पेंट शेषनाग स्कल्पचर फ्रॉम दियोगढ़. दियोगढ़ अगेन इज उत्तर प्रदेश. So यहाँ पे क्या थे? Some of the earliest of these were constructed in the 3rd century BCE on the order of Ashoka for renouncers who belonged to the Ajivika sect. तो Ajivika sect के जो renouncers थे उनके लिए कुछ बनाया गया था. The tradition evolved through various stages and culminated much later in the 8th century in the carving of an entire temple, that of Kailashna, the name of Shiva. ठीक है. द कॉपर प्लेट इंस्क्रिप्शन जो है, इट रिकॉर्ड द अमेजमेंट ऑफ द चीफ स्कल्प्टर आफ्टर ही completed a temple at Allora, that is the Kailashnan, and oh, how did I make it? So an entrance to a cave at बाराबर. बाराबर कहाँ पर है? बिहार में. ठीक है. कैलाशनाथ टेम्पल है आपका एलोरा में, महाराष्ट्र में. दिस एंटायर स्ट्रक्चर इज carved of a single piece of rock. Can we see everything? By now you have had a glimpse of the rich visual traditions that existed in the past, expressed in brick, stone architecture, stone architecture, sculptures, painting. We have seen that much has been destroyed and lost over the centuries. Nevertheless, what remains and has been preserved conveys a sense of vision to the of the artists, sculptors, masons, architects who created this spectacular work. Yet, do we always automatically understood what they wanted to convey? Can we know what these images meant to people who saw them and venerated them about 2000 years ago? Grappling with the unfamiliar, it will be useful to recall that when 19th century European scholars first saw some of the sculptures of god and goddess, they could not understand what these were about. Sometimes they were horrified by what seemed to be to them grotesque figure with multiple arms and heads, or with combination of human and animal form. These early scholars tried to make sense of what appeared to be strange images by comparing them with the sculptures. ये थोड़ा सा एक सेकेंड में वापस से पढ़ती हूँ. It will be very useful to recall that when 19th century European scholars they first saw some of the sculptures of god and goddess, they could not understand what they were about. Sometimes they were horrified by what seemed them to be as grotesque figure with multiple arms, heads, or with combination of human animal form. These early scholars they tried to make sense of what appeared to be very strange images by comparing them with the sculptures with which they were familiar, that is of ancient Greece. While they often found early Indian sculptures inferior to the works of Greek artists, they were very excited when they discovered images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that were evidently based on Greek model. though these were more often than not found in the northwest in cities such as Takshila and Peshawar, where Indo-Greek rulers had established kingdom in the 2nd century BCE. As these images were closest to the Greek statues which these scholars were familiar with, they were considered to be the best example of early Indian art. In effect, these scholars adopted a strategy we all frequently use, devising yardsticks derived from the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar. If text and image do not match, consider another problem. We have seen that art historians often draw upon textual tradition to understand the meaning of sculptures. जो art historians हैं वो text पे believe करते हैं. While this is certainly a far more efficacious strategy than comparing Indian images with Greek statue, it is not always easy to use. One of the most intriguing examples of this is a famous sculpture along a huge rock surface in Mahabalipuram, that is in Tamil Nadu. Clearly, it is a vivid depiction of a story, but which story is it? Art historians have searched through the Puranas to identify it and are sharply divided in their opinion. Some feel that this depicts the descent of the river Ganga from heaven. This is Bodhisattva from Gandhara. ठीक है? So what? Where were we? Oh God, this is okay. Depicts the descent of river Ganga from heaven, and the natural cleft through the center of the rock surface might represent the river. The story itself is narrated in the Puranas and the epics. Others feel that it is represent a story from the Mahabharata, that is Arjun doing penance on the river bank in order to acquire arms, pointing to the central figure of an ascetic. Though finally remember that many rituals, religious belief and practice were not recorded in a permanent and visible form, that's like monuments, sculptures or even in paintings. These include daily practice as well as those associated with a special occasion. Many communities and people may not have felt the need for keeping the lasting record, even as they may have had vibrant traditions of religious activities and philosophical ideas. In fact, the spectacular instance we have focused 1500 से 1000 BC early Vedic tradition, 1000 से 500 years later 6th century BC early Upanishad Jainism and Buddhism, 3rd century BC से first stupa, 2nd century BCE की बात करते हैं डेवलपमेंट ऑफ महायाना बुद्धिज्म, वैष्णविज्म, सैविज्म, गॉडेस कल्ट, 3rd century CE की द अर्लीस्ट टेम्पल, 1814 जो है फाउंडिंग ऑफ द इंडियन म्यूजियम इन कैलकाटा, 1834 publication of essay on the architecture of the Hindu by Ramraj. Cunningham explored the stupa at Sarnath. 1835-1840 James Ferguson survey major archaeological site. 1851 establishment of government museum in Madras. 1854 Alexander Cunningham publishes Bilsa Tope, one of the earliest work on Sanchi. 1878 राजेंद्र लाल मित्रा पब्लिश बुद्ध गया द हेरिटेज ऑफ शाक्य मुनि. ये बहुत ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है, इसको ध्यान से देना पड़ेगा. पीछे से पढ़ते हैं एक बार. 1985 में सांची को एक वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज साइट डिक्लेयर कर दिया गया. 1955 में प्राइम मिनिस्टर जवाहरलाल नेहरू ने एक फाउंडेशन स्टोन रखी थी नेशनल म्यूजियम इन न्यू दिल्ली. 1923 में जॉन मार्शल ने कंजर्वेशन मैनुअल पब्लिश किया था. कंजर्वेशन मैनुअल किसने पब्लिश किया था? जॉन मार्शल ने 1923 में. 1914 में जॉन मार्शल और एल्फ्रेड फाउचर ने मॉन्यूमेंट ऑफ सांची को पब्लिश किया था. 1888 में पासिंग of the Treasure Trove Act giving the government the right to acquire all objects of archaeological interest. H.H. Cole appointed curator of ancient museum. H.H. Cole के बारे में पढ़ा था हमने. 1870 में राजेंद्र लाल मित्रा पब्लिश बुद्ध गया द हेरिटेज ऑफ शाक्य मुनि. फिर 1854 में अलेक्जेंडर कनिंगम पब्लिशेस बिल्सा टोपे, वन ऑफ द अर्लीस्ट वर्क ऑन सांची. बिल्सा टोप्स किसने लिखी थी? बिल्सा टोप अलेक्जेंडर कनिंगम. किस पे? वर्क ऑन सांची पे. फिर गवर्नमेंट म्यूजियम मद्रास 1851. 1835-42 में जेम्स फर्ग्यूसन सर्वे मेजर आर्कोलॉजिकल साइट. 1814 फाउंडिंग ऑफ द इंडियन म्यूजियम कैलकाटा. ओके, कंप्लीटेड. थैंक यू सो मच.